Hey, we are going to pick up week 4 with the Reconstruction. We talked about the Reconstruction some last week. We're going to continue that through this week. So, just a quick little review. We've got the Northern Army, led by Abraham Lincoln, General U.S. Grant. Of course, there were many more generals than just Grant, but he's the guy that took it home. The advantages of the Northern Army. They had more money, more factories, and more people, and they also controlled the Navy and the railroads. And of course, the Union Army is another name for the North, and they were also called the Yankees. And you can see in this picture, that is actually a restoration of a picture from the Civil War, but this is a group of surgeons, actually, not soldiers. So this was taken right near the end of the war. And you can see the dismal conditions that they would have been operating in with the dirt floors and um, not the cleanest of environments. In the South, we had President Jefferson Davis and the famous General Robert E. Lee. And the advantages of the Southern Army were they had better generals, just better military in general, the people. They had better horsemen, marksmen. These are young men that had grown up their entire lives riding and shooting. So they just knew what they were doing. They knew how to handle a gun and ride a horse. And the South also had the advantage of being on their home ground. It makes you always fight a little bit harder if you're defending something that you know and love personally. And this army went by the Confederate Army, and they were also called the Rebels. Of course, we have Lee surrendering to Grant. Lee is the gentleman on the right in this first picture. He's wearing the gray. The Civil War is sometimes referred to the blue and the gray, and the blue was the Union Northern Army, and the gray was the Confederate Army. But this is Lee here on the right, and this is U.S. Grant on the left. And Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, which, just as a reminder, is not an actual courthouse. That was the name of the town. He surrendered in the McLean House. And the two images on the right, you can see that they're actually in someone's residence. And Lee signed the papers to surrender to Grant. Unfortunately, at this point in the war, we know that there are over 618,000 people that have lost their life in this conflict. The Civil War is over. Lincoln is thrilled. He's like, yes, we can finally work towards bringing the country back together. And then, unfortunately, he met an early demise when John Wilkes Booth shoots him in the back of the head while he was in attendance of Ford's Theater watching a comedy. Enter Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was the vice president and took the place of Lincoln after Lincoln's assassination. When Lincoln chose Andrew Johnson as his vice president, it wasn't necessarily because they had a huge alignment of their ideals, but it was because Lincoln thought he would be the best candidate to bring unity back to the country. Lincoln's looking toward the future. He's like, the war's almost over. The North and South are divided. How can we bring the people back together? So Lincoln is a Republican. Andrew Johnson is a Democrat. He was from the South, born in North Carolina, set up business and lived mostly in Tennessee. And when the South seceded, Andrew Johnson was the only man that stayed in the North during the Civil War. And so Lincoln thought he would be an ideal candidate that hopefully he would appeal to both parties, the North because he had stayed in the North, and the South because that is where he heralded from. So here we have a picture of Andrew Johnson in his swearing in ceremony right after the death of Lincoln. What a lot of people don't realize is that John Wilkes Booth, when he organized the plot against Lincoln, it wasn't a sole attack against Lincoln. He had decided not only to kill President Lincoln, but also to kill Vice President Johnson, and he also wanted to kill the Secretary of State, William Seward. So on that night, Booth had his men, a team of people. He ordered George Atzerodt to assassinate Andrew Johnson. So he had gone to the Kirkwood house to do that. And when he got there, he decided against killing Johnson. So instead, he fled the city, but he was actually captured and convicted, and he ended up hanging for his part in the assassination plot. Um, but shortly after Lincoln was shot, Johnson wakes up to a knock at his door, and Leonard Farwell, who was a friend of his, actually the governor of Wisconsin, came and told him what had happened at Ford's Theater. So around dawn, uh, Johnson walked a couple of blocks to the Peterson boarding house where Lincoln was, on his deathbed, and he saw the president before, he died, and paid his respects to Lincoln's wife and his son Robert. Um, and then he went back home. But when he learned officially of Lincoln's death, which was 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, he sent word to the cabinet that he was prepared to take the oath of office. So the cabinet, you know, got the ball rolling, and around 11 o'clock, so a pretty fast turnaround, really, several of the members of the cabinet and some senators went to go and be witness as Andrew Johnson was sworn in as president. Johnson turned to everyone, gave a brief little speech, and he told all the men that were there. He said, "This is a quote I'm going to read to you. The duties of the office are mine. I will perform them. The consequences are with God. Gentlemen, I shall lean upon you. I feel I shall need your support. I am deeply impressed with the solemnity of this occasion and the responsibilities of the duties of the office I am assuming." So much better response than perhaps Abraham Lincoln's inauguration, where Johnson was actually drunk. So this is a little throwback moment to the first inauguration when Lincoln was being inaugurated president. But Andrew Johnson did end up showing up to the inauguration drunk. He was feeling sick. And so right before the ceremony, he throws down 3 glasses of whiskey, and he told Hamlin. Now, Hamlin is Abraham Lincoln's first vice president, and he's at the ceremony so that he can give his vice presidency to the next person. So Hamlin was there with him, and he told Hamlin, "I need all the strength I can get." Then he threw down 3 glasses of whiskey, and the audience noticed. Not just because Johnson's face was bright red, but he started making his little address, which was supposed to be around 5 minutes. It ended up being over 3 times longer than that. He was shouting, gesturing wildly. He was stumbling all over his words, shaking his fist. He was yelling about, "I'm the man of the people. Tennessee never left the Union, blah, blah, blah." And Hamlin, he's trying to be dignified here. He's trying to like shut him up, pull him away, but he failed in both. And Johnson kept stammering. And the Attorney General leaned over and said to the Secretary of Navy, "What a wretched mess." Johnson's either drunk or crazy. So Johnson finally stopped his meandering, and he was kind of wandering around the stage, and he let Hamlin administer the oath of office. But unfortunately, he bungled through that too, and he was stumbling over his words, and he was adding his own commentary into the swearing in. And right at the end, after he had done the swearing in, you put your hand on the Bible. And so Johnson picked up the Bible and kissed it, put it on his lips and kissed it. And then he said, "I kiss this book in the face of my nation of the United States." So it was just generally a mess. Now, Lincoln took it all in stride. He denied to the press that his vice president was a drunkard, and just called it a bad slip. But Johnson stayed out of the press for the next few days, and you can see from this slide that the press had a field day. The article at the top is an article from Library of Congress, and it's just like the little intro to what happened. at the inauguration that he was drunk. You can see he's depicted as a donkey, another word for a donkey. On the right, you can see he's holding his whiskey bottle and stomping around like he's the king. And of course, you see his little scissors and his fine garments because remember, he was a tailor. At the bottom center, you can see, oh, it cut it off. But you can see, well, you can't see, but he's actually holding whiskey in this picture and he's having a drink with the devil before his inauguration ceremony. And then the one in the bottom left corner is an actual picture, a tintype of the inauguration. So you can see Lincoln and Johnson there to his right. And can we just stop and admire Abe's haircut? He was looking fresh for his ceremony. Okay, we will wrap up here with this slide. You can see in this first slide here, the last one depicted him as a king, but this extended even further. And you can see at the bottom, across the bottom, it says, "Long live King Andy." So Johnson, as he was in power, ended up earning the nickname the Veto President. And a lot of people called him King Andy because they thought he was way overextending his authority because of how much he was vetoing. Um, Johnson was not well liked by the Republicans, and they're the ones that held the most votes in Congress. Remember, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, and most of the people in Congress were Republicans. Um, and Johnson wanted even more leniency for the Confederate supporters that were rejoining the Union, even more than Lincoln. He thought that all um, the people that had seceded from the Union, that they should just be welcomed back into society with no reprimand. So President Johnson allowed Southern states to elect ex-Confederate officials back to U.S. Congress. And so that completely alienated him from the Republicans that already held power. So they were not happy with that. Johnson was also against freeing the slaves. He was instrumental in giving pardons to numerous Confederate supporters, and he vetoed like crazy, vetoed like a madman. He vetoed like a king, like he was the authoritarian ruler. He vetoed legislation like the Freedmen's Bureau, the Civil Rights Bill. He encouraged Southern states not to ratify the 14th Amendment. So he was far more interested in helping the Southern states rebuild their farms and their infrastructure more than helping the newly freed slaves. He didn't really care anything about that. Pretty soon, his actions boiled over with the Republicans because he ended up firing his war secretary, Edward Stanton, which everyone loved. And you can see at the bottom, I put a quote here. It said, "From summer 1866 on, both General Grant, that's U.S. Grant, that was the general of the Civil War for the North, and War Secretary Edwin Stanton were resisting, often all but openly defying Johnson's orders from within an executive branch." What this means is Congress and the presidency started getting into a battle of who could control the way things were going to be. So Congress would pass a bill, Johnson would veto the bill, Congress would it would get sent back to Congress and they would override the veto. And to do so, you have to have a 3/4 majority. So that was a huge deal that they were able to veto or override his veto on so many votes. When he fired Edwin Stanton without cause, from their perspective, that was kind of the last straw, and that's when people began calling for Andrew Johnson to be impeached.